Hi, everybody. Happy Sunday. Well, how shall we start this? I just checked my email, and of course, I didn't have anybody email me any questions. I kind of wish that there was a way that you could ask questions verbally, where like if you had a microphone function, I could actually hear you. All right, well, if you're able to actually comment, or if you're able to actually communicate with me in the live chat, would you go ahead and say something? Go ahead and type something in so I know who I can direct questions to, or if people are ready to go. Hi, McKenna. Well, McKenna, you said you had lots of questions on Friday, and so hopefully I answered them all, but I'm guessing with the limited time that we had, I did not. So do you have any questions I can start with? The Chesapeake Affair is the incident where in 1807, the British attacked a U.S. naval ship called the Chesapeake off of the coast of Virginia. And so this is just one example of where the British harassed our ships at sea. But it also became a rallying cry for the War of 1812, even though the War of 1812 is obviously 5 years in the future. Americans had not forgotten that offense. And so along with On to Canada, Remember the Chesapeake became a battle cry of war hawks who wanted to see the British punished for their abuse of American sailors and the fact that they didn't respect our trading rights. So we read about that, Mike. Hopefully you remember with the War of 1812, we had the commander of the ship kind of explain what had taken place. And 4 people were removed from the Chesapeake. The British claimed that they were Canadian deserters, and the captain of the Chesapeake maintained that they were American citizens. Is that sufficient, Mike? And McKenna asks, what was the significance of the Haitian Revolution? We didn't talk too much about the Haitian Revolution, and I'll just kind of identify the very brief elements of it. I obviously included it in the Ed puzzles, but a couple of different things. And number one, I think it's interesting to point out again with Jefferson how he's a man of contradiction. During the Jefferson administration, Haiti was fighting for its own independence. It's the first big slave revolt that actually leads to an independence movement. And Jefferson was aware of it going on. And yet, despite for all his rhetoric about fighting for independence, in the American way and how he had supported French independence. Now, as Haiti tried to throw off the shackles of colonialism from Napoleon, we were not going to support a revolution of black slaves in the Caribbean. But it did help the United States acquire the Louisiana Territory, and here's how. As we talked about, after the French and Indian War, Spain took control of Louisiana. We had gotten our right to deposit at the port of New Orleans so that American farmers could ship their goods down to Louisiana and through the Gulf of Mexico out to wherever it needed to go. But Napoleon wanted to buy Louisiana in 1802 as a way to feed the French sugar islands and to feed his armies in Europe. So it was going to become kind of like a breadbasket for the French army. Well, that was the plan until the Haitian Revolution took place. And at that point, the expense that the French military was putting into putting that revolution down, and the fact that it was losing its sugar islands made it no longer feasible for it to hold on to Louisiana. So he wanted to do a quick turnaround and sell it to the United States for a profit and use that money to support his war in Europe. Okay. So, Haiti has always been a part of our history. And Haiti, of course, is one of two nations on the island of Hispaniola, which was the island that Christopher Columbus first toured. And so I don't know how many of you have ever thought about mission work or anything like that, but Haiti is an absolute mess. But it was the first territory to declare its independence that was formerly a slave island. Other questions? So I've got Mike and McKenna, and they're going to get all their questions answered tonight because they're the only two that are typing and responding. Although there's 14 people in, that's like what? Okay, Mike wants to know about the Judiciary Act of 1789. So this is tied into the Marbury versus Madison case, Mike. So we've got two Judiciary Acts, 1789 and 1801. Okay, but let me just kind of remind you about Marbury versus Madison and the big pictures of that, and then I'll reference them in relationship to Marbury versus Madison because that's going to be the more important thing to understand. Anyway, so Marbury versus Madison is the Supreme Court case that establishes judicial review. John Marshall, Chief Justice, works his law interpreting magic in creating judiciary review because the Constitution itself does not give the courts the power to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. That's what Marshall does in Marbury versus Madison. He declares the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. Okay, so what the Judiciary Act of 1789 had done as it's relative to the case is it had said the Supreme Court should hear cases dealing with executive appointments, that it should hear them first, primary jurisdiction. Well, John Marshall says, no, the only thing that gives us our jurisdiction is the Constitution, and so the irony is he uses a strict interpretation to say only the Constitution can tell the courts what it can do. Yet in checking calling the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, he takes this power of judicial review for the courts that's not written in the Constitution. That's the irony. That's the beauty of it. And that establishes the court as a co-equal branch of government. I think that's about as concise. That's as concise as I can be with that. It's a long, tangled, wonderful story if you love judicial history and government and things like that. Otherwise, for your purposes, that's about as good as it needs to be. Izzy, can you talk about the American system of the 1820s? Sure. So that is Henry Clay, right? And Henry Clay is going to play an important role in the next couple of chapters as we look at westward expansion and as we look at the compromises that America is making concerning slavery. But the American system is Clay's plan to grow, to build America, basically, post War of 1812. So first of all, we have to appreciate War of 1812 creates an era of nationalism. This idea that we no longer need to be tied to Europe, that what we need to do is to create a powerful, independent America, and that future faces west. And so the American system under Henry Clay is going to implement three things. Number one, a strong tariff, okay, to protect American manufacturing and mostly American manufacturing. If you recall, under the War of 1812 and the embargoes that the previous presidents had implemented, a small manufacturing complex was starting to develop. So the tariff was going to protect that. Number two, transportation. So transportation systems connecting the East, especially the Northeast, where the manufacturing was building and where merchants were available to ship American goods to foreign countries. So to improve transportation through better roads and canals. The Erie Canal was developed by the state of New York. And so that's something that Henry Clay wants to push. Number three, national bank. Okay, the Bank of the U.S. Is going to provide for a more stable currency and more effective, efficient credit for the nation. So you think about all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, the government will invest in a bank, put money in a bank, and that bank will release money or take in money to help control inflation. It's going to set interest rates or do a better job of managing interest rates so that they're not too high or too low, so that creditors are going to make a profit off of their loans and that borrowers can find access to reasonable loans. But with that, it's going to do a better job of collecting on loans and making sure that people pay their loans back to the creditors or that there's compensation for the creditors. So what we're going to see with the Bank of the United States is the West is really going to resent that because they want cheap, low interest, inconsistent enforcement on loans so that speculators in the West can buy up a whole bunch of land on credit. And so the West really wants cheap money. The North and the coast really want stable currency. So transportation, banks, and tariffs are the big parts of Henry Clay's American system. Let me see if I can find an American system question example here. The next person can go ahead and post a question if they have it, but just as an example. My wife's going to bed. Oh, they wanted to see you, by the way. Yeah. It's low lighting over here, by the way. Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. Who would put up with me? Here's a good example of an American system question. Henry Clay embraced a program in 1824 that called the American system, which would create all of the following except, okay? So which of these is not part of the American system? A strong banking system. B, easy and abundant credit. C, a protective tariff to enable manufacturing to grow. D, a network of roads and canals for transportation of foodstuff, raw materials, and manufactured goods nationwide. Or E, the constitutional right for individual states to nullify laws enacted by Congress. Okay, so which of those are the right answer for the American system? Strong bank, abundant credit, protective tariff, network of roads, the right to nullify for states. McKenna gets the cookie. That's right. It is E, the right to nullify. That's correct. Okay. JD, could you talk about the Monroe Doctrine? Yep. What you need to know about the Monroe Doctrine is it was a self-defense kind of doctrine that warned Europe, like a freshman warning a senior to stay out of their way. The Monroe Doctrine warned Europe, specifically Britain, considering the circumstances, to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Basically declared the Western Hemisphere closed to European colonization, and that America had a right to defend its interests, defend itself, and to protect the Western Hemisphere from colonization. Okay. We will talk more about the Monroe Doctrine when we get to the 20th century because of its use by President McKinley and Roosevelt than we are right now. Just keep in mind that right now it's a good reflection of nationalism. This idea that, hey, we didn't lose to Britain a second time, and now the Western Hemisphere is all about the United States, and we won't tolerate any European colonies challenging us or threatening us. And what Monroe was worried about was that Britain would establish a foothold in Latin America as Spain fell away. And so he issues this document, the Monroe Doctrine, which is largely ignored, but it's going to be the basis for foreign policy when we get to the very beginning of the 20th century. Okay. McKenna, why did the Battle of New Orleans happen after the Treaty of Ghent? Because transportation between Europe and North America took so long. There's no high-speed communication method. You have to transport information across the sea by boat, and so that takes a couple of weeks, and that's why it seems bizarre to us, but it was common for battles to take place after a treaty had been signed, and it just was part of the natural consequences of the way the world was as far as communication at that time. And so with a big battle like that, it wasn't uncommon for the sides to say, well, it happened. We're not going to redraw. We're not going to redraw the contract, or we're not going to redraw the treaty. The treaty was effective. And so even if Britain had, let's say, captured New Orleans, it's pretty unlikely that they would have demanded a new treaty to be written. Okay. All right. Goodness gracious, how many Supreme Court cases would you like us to know about, or which ones had the most important impact on the judicial system? Is goodness gracious, I'm hoping, is the person's name, but goodness gracious, this is what I want you to know about courts, okay? Number one, we've got Marbury versus Madison. If you've got a good grip on what Marbury versus Madison did for the judicial branch and the creation of judicial review, that's good. John Marshall, okay? If there's a person whose name hasn't been spoken into your knowledge bank until this unit, I would think it'd be John Marshall. And knowing him as a Federalist judge, remember, he's appointed by President Adams, and he's the one that gives us the Marbury versus Madison decision. But knowing John Marshall as the most important Chief Justice of American history is important. There's mention of I think 3 or 4 different court cases that took place in chapter 12. And I really only talked about 2, but there's one trend. The trend is that the court cases under John Marshall make the national government stronger. Okay. So McCulloch v. Maryland, which basically said that the states cannot tax the national government. The power to tax is the power to destroy. And because the Constitution makes the government supreme, the national government is protected by the supremacy clause, the states cannot tax the national government. Okay, so the national government being protected and its supremacy being elevated in that case is one thing. The states and their inability to tax is another. So we start to see that the courts are answering this question of who's in charge, which wasn't so clear when we moved away from the Articles of Confederation. The other court case that we talked about briefly in class is Gibbons v. Ogden, which basically once again told the states they cannot manage interstate commerce. Okay, you guys have all driven on an interstate road. It's a road that goes between 2 or more states and receives federal funding. Interstate commerce, trade between 2 or more states, states cannot regulate that. That is federal territory. So once again, Marshall puts the states in their place, says national government is superior to state government. States cannot assume national power. And so it's answering these questions. What are states allowed to do? And time again, it's the national government's more powerful. Okay, so that's really what I wanted you to take away, at least this time around, from John Marshall and the decisions he's involved in. Claire, could you go over the big ideas we would need to be cozy for the test? and that comes from Sophie. Cozy. Well, I think we've started that because you guys are asking some good, challenging questions. But I'll keep doing my best. If there's something specific, let me know. Okay, Mike again. Didn't they leave England out of the doctrine? I thought that England wanted to stay out of the Western Hemisphere so they could still trade. No, England was, the concern was that as Spain was having problems in controlling its colonies in Latin America, that England would make an inroad into Latin America. And we'll talk more about that down the road, but in fact, England does have a foothold in Latin America, in Nicaragua. And we'll deal with that when we get to the Panama Canal and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure what would have led you to believe that, Mike. But that's not going to be. I don't think that's right from my understanding. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. Another question. It was on the video for Chapter 11, Episode 4. Well, Chapter 11, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you have your timeline might be confused on this. Chapter 11, you're looking at War of 1812, and prior to the War of 1812. So there you're looking at Jefferson and Madison, right? And the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act and McCone's Bill number 2. Those things happened before Monroe. So your timeline, you're getting out of the chronology here. And that's really important to understand. With the War of 1812, we have this wave of nationalism where it's like, okay, well, we can hold our own and we can start telling the world how it is here in the Western Hemisphere. I think that might be the confusion. I think you might be confusing the Monroe Doctrine with the Embargo Act or the Non-Intercourse Act or McCone's Bill number 2. Is that possible, Mike? Okay, he says yes. Well, let me just kind of preview the topics here that some of the test questions talk about. The election of 1800, revolution of 1800, and the tie between Jefferson and Burr. What types of people were opposed to the War of 1812? What role Canada had in the War of 1812? Warhawks. The Battle of Tippecanoe and Tecumseh. Sorry, I'm loading. Obviously, the Embargo Act, the Non-Intercourse Act, the McCone's Bill number 2. So the different economic approaches that Jefferson, Madison took against Britain prior to the War of 1812, the consequences of those embargoes, right? The one nation that it hurt was us. Impressment, the Chesapeake Affair, Aaron Burr and his efforts after he killed Alexander Hamilton. Why Jefferson was conscience-stricken about the purchase of Louisiana, right? Keeping in mind the Democratic Republican principles. The Voyage of Discovery. Sacagawea. The political differences between Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Midnight Judges and Marbury versus Madison. John Marshall. What the original intention of Jefferson was about in the Louisiana Purchase versus what the outcome was. So remember that the original intention was to buy New Orleans and the area around it for $10 million, and then we ended up getting the Louisiana Territory for $15 million. The Barbary Wars, Monroe Doctrine, the John Quincy Adams treaties that we've talked about. So like the Rush-Bagot, the Anglo-American, the Adams-Onis treaties. Andrew Jackson, Battle of New Orleans. John Marshall's court. The Missouri Compromise. The Talmadge Amendment. The American System. the Western Land Boom and the Land Act of 1820. The Bank of the United States, the Era of Good Feelings, the Hartford Convention, the outcome of the War of 1812, Treaty of Ghent, the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, that's reached the end of my list here. All right, now I'm going to bring my window pane back up. It looks like you guys have been typing. Let me just... Mike is asking if I'd explain the Russo-American Treaty. Oh, and that's from Lauren. There aren't going to be any questions about the Russo-American Treaty, but that really, what it did was it struck out an agreement between the United States and Russia as to what territory the Russians could control, basically in the southern part of what is today Alaska. The concern was that the Russians were going to claim the Pacific coastline, and so it just drew out kind of a preemptive treaty that kept them further north. John Mangold, can you go over the timeline of the Missouri Compromise? I'm not sure what you mean by timeline. It took place in 1820. The situation was that in 1819, Missouri was ready to become a state, and that would have thrown off the sectional balance between North and South. Northerners wanted to attach the Talmadge Amendment to it, which would have gradually phased out slavery from Missouri. And of course, the South didn't want that because they felt like then the Missouri would align with with Northern interests. So there was a stalemate, and Henry Clay, to the rescue, proposed the Missouri Compromise, which would allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, Maine to come in as a free state, and draw a line across the southern border of Missouri that would stretch across the continent. And from that point forward, slavery would be abolished north of that line, with the exception of Missouri. Izzy wants to know, can you go over the Land Act of 1820 and the Talmadge Amendment? Okay, so with the elimination of Britain for the second time, and the wave of nationalism that hits the country, in this sense that America's destiny is West. And we have people like Henry Clay talking about the American system. And so the American population is naturally moving west where land availability is. What the Land Act of 1820 does is it drops the price the federal government is charging for the purchase of land out west. And so really what it's going to do is motivate people to go and settle these territories. Is going to give places like Missouri a bigger population. And it really is going to create a third section of the country, the American West. The Talmadge Amendment is the proposal that Missouri comes in, even if it is a slave state, that slavery be weaned away from Missouri over a period of time. And so ultimately Missouri would be a free state, and the South opposes that. And then we get the Missouri Compromise. trying to find a question here about the Land Act. Well, here's one that references it. The Western land boom from 1791 to 1824 resulted from all of the following except A, the Land Act of 1820 and the development of transportation to and through the Northwest and West. B, land exhaustion in old tobacco states. C, acute economic distress in the East during the embargo years, prompted by many Americans to settle in the West. D, the frontier was pacified in the Northwest and the South with the military defeats of the Indians. Or E, construction of railroad lines west of the Mississippi River. Which of those is incorrect? I'll give you your options in brief again. The Land Act, so cheap land and transportation. Land exhaustion in old plantation states. Economic distress from the embargo. Defeat of the Native Americans in the Old Northwest and in the South, or the construction of the railroad west of the Mississippi. John says it's C. It's not C. It's not C, actually. Was there distress in the East from the embargo? There's lots of stress in the East from the embargo. Remember, that was a big complaint of New Englanders. McKenna says it's B, land exhaustion. I thought we heard from someone in the game that we were playing with the War of 1812 that one of the reasons that Westerners kept pushing further and further was because they didn't rotate their crops, corn. The answer is E. Why are the railroads west of the Mississippi incorrect? See, these are all things that you know, but you don't take time to consider the question. Is there anything west of the Mississippi at this point as far as America is concerned? No, right? We're just starting to come up over the hills of the Appalachians and settle in the Ohio River Valley and in Missouri and Arkansas and that kind of thing. But there's nothing really west. That's Lewis and Clark territory. They went out there. And furthermore, the railroad, you think about chronology. We're building roads and canals, not railroads yet. The Union Pacific Railroad won't get started until the 1850s, and then 1860 we'll start the railroad in Omaha. So it's one of those things where the devil is in the details. Okay. So hopefully, whoever had asked me to do an overview, Sophie, I think, hopefully you felt like, I did talk about each of the themes that I was seeing on the test. Anything else? Well, I've gone through half. I'm still making my way through the DBQs that you guys did, and so I've got first and fourth periods DBQs all graded. I still have sixth and eighth period DBQs to do, but things are looking pretty good. So if you're in first or fourth period and you want to check out, see my feedback on those, they should be good to go. I haven't plugged them all into the grade book yet, but you'll see the grade that you'll be getting if you go into turnitin.com. Well, seems like we're wrapping up then. But I'm happy to answer more questions. Let's see. Here's a good question. One of the West's persistent political demands. Okay. What did Westerners want? A strong currency, a strong bank, cheap money, federal aid for agriculture, or none of these things? What did the West want? Strong money, strong bank, cheap money, federal aid, or none of these things? Everybody's gone silent. Well, what did they oppose? Think about this. What did they oppose? I think we've established now that the West has opposed the bank all along. Okay, which of those things would be affected most by a bank? And McKenna, very rarely is it none of the above. I've noticed with to be honest, with at least with this textbook's quiz generator, I have yet to see none of the above as the right answer. Not that it won't ever be, but that is not the right answer either. So a strong currency, a strong bank, a weak currency, cheap money, federal aid, or none of the above. Another little hint that, well, it's not foolproof, but oftentimes if you're given something that sounds like a 50-50, it probably is. So we can narrow this one down to a strong currency or a cheap currency? McKenna's locking in at cheap. Anyone going to stick with McKenna on this? You're right, McKenna. It is a cheap currency. A cheap currency and an unregulated bank. Westerners were all about getting fast and easy loans. They didn't care about the value of money or the risks in investing in that kind of thing. They were land hungry. Think about all of these Quicken Loans and stuff, those centers that you see. Think about all those Quicken Loans and centers that you see like in those strip malls and stuff where people, and I don't want to, I'll withhold my assessment of the people that typically use Quicken Loans and that type of thing, but usually they're people that need a loan fast, and they're going to go and they're going to spend, they're not going to save it, they're going to turn around and spend it and that kind of thing. And so Westerners were all about the cheap and accessible, available money, the hopes that they wouldn't have somebody enforcing the terms of the loan, that they wouldn't go bankrupt, that they, even if they defaulted on the loan, that they would be out of the reach of a strong bank. Weak banks, cheap money. That's what Westerners wanted. And then, Claire, you're also right. I didn't mean to ignore you. The transportation end is also a big thing as well. They're going to want state and federal governments to fund those transportation projects. But since that wasn't one of the options, we need to still consider that there are other things that fit into the puzzle. All right, well, we've got 7 minutes left. Let's see, I guess I can ask another question. What was the first state entirely west of the Mississippi carved out of the Louisiana Territory? West of the Mississippi. Kansas, Louisiana, Iowa, Arkansas, or Missouri? Claire, pull up a tab and look at a map of the United States and tell me if Missouri is west of the Mississippi. These are the types of questions, and I mean, I feel for you guys because it is so easy for your brain to go on autopilot and be like, oh, all I've been hearing about is Missouri, right? That's got to be Missouri. There's the Missouri Compromise. We just were talking about that, but this is how they get you. And I know you know your cardinal directions. And I know once you look at a map, it's like, oh, yeah, I knew that it was east, that Missouri is east of the Mississippi. No, Kansas is not right. Why did we make the Louisiana Purchase in the first place? For New Orleans, right? There are lots of people living down in New Orleans. So the first state west of the Mississippi is Louisiana. No, it's not. Missouri is east of the Mississippi. All right. So I'm not a geography teacher, but the answer is Louisiana. Maybe I'm incredibly embarrassed. You're right. But it is Louisiana. That I do know. I don't know what to say other than I'm really embarrassed, but you got me on that one. No, I'm glad you did stop by. Hopefully everything else has been accurate. But the Louisiana is what we're looking for there. All right. Any other questions? Thank you, tall person. Well, yeah. Well, students won't let me forget that. I'm sure that I'll still be sweating over that tomorrow. I can no longer criticize people for their own poor geography skills. I'm only making the problem worse. All right, 8 pushers, what else? I mean, we have 18 people on here. People are coming on to see the sideshow bad geography. right. Well, then I'm going to officially call it then. If there are no further questions, I hope. How do people feel? If you before you take off, let me know how you're feeling as far as confidence wise, or if you have any other questions. I'm going to check my email real quick. Oh, Sophie, I got your email, and hopefully you feel like I covered some of that stuff. Any other feedback before we call it a night? How are we feeling? Good? Mike says great. Well, I hope it's been helpful. I mean, I would assume that you wouldn't take an hour out of your evening if it wasn't helpful, but Izzy's feeling better, Mike John's feeling better. Anybody feeling worse other than me? Go study a map test tomorrow for myself. I'm just one of those people that has no sense of humor when it comes to my own shortcomings, where it's like supposed to be perfect. All right. Well, we'll see you all then tomorrow. Goodness gracious, thank you. Have a great night, everybody.